The sky over Europe in September 1944 was a canvas of hope and terror, painted with the exhaust trails of thousands of Allied bombers and the shadow of the German war machine. The war had been raging for over 5 years, each month carving deeper lines into the faces of those who fought. Yet, despite the heavy losses and the endless sorties, there was a growing sense among the crews of the U.S. 8th Air Force that the tide was turning. Victory felt close, but danger was still very real. For the men aboard the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, every mission was a gamble with death. The B-17, with its silver fuselage glinting in the sun and heavy defensive armaments, was a symbol of American determination. These planes carried bombs that could devastate factories, railways, and military installations, aiming to cripple Germany's capacity to fight. But flying over occupied Europe was never a simple task. Every mission meant navigating through layers of flak anti-aircraft artillery that shredded the sky with deadly precision and the ever-present threat of German fighters. Daylight bombing was particularly perilous. Night raids allowed the cover of darkness, but accuracy suffered. Daylight meant precision, but also meant facing death head-on. September 1944 was no ordinary month. The Allies had broken through much of Western Europe after the D-Day landings in June, and the Luftwaffe was struggling to maintain its dominance in the skies. Many German pilots had been killed, captured, or transferred, leaving inexperienced men behind the controls of formidable aircraft. For American crews, this should have been good news, but experience had taught them that the enemy, even weakened, could strike with sudden ferocity. Every mission carried a story of bravery, fear, and the strange camaraderie that only arises when men face the possibility of instant death together. It was on the 11th of September that a particular group of B-17 crews experienced something they would never forget. They took off from bases in England, heavy with bombs, heading over France and into the heart of Germany. The plan was simple in its objective, but impossible to simplify in its danger: destroy key infrastructure and return home. The sky that morning was unusually clear, sunlight bouncing off the aluminum skins of the bombers, glinting against the clouds that marked the horizon. The crews, tired from previous missions, were alert but hopeful. They had survived countless raids before. They could do it again. As they climbed to their assigned altitudes, the first signs of danger appeared. Small black dots far in the distance, barely visible against the backdrop of the sky, began to take shape. The men squinted, trying to identify them through the wind-smeared glass of the cockpit. Initially, they expected the familiar silhouettes of the Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, the German fighters they had faced countless times, but these were different, sleeker, faster, the kind of aircraft they had only read about in intelligence reports or glimpsed in photographs. These were jets, the Messerschmitt Me 262 seconds, the world's first operational jet-powered fighters, and they were hunting the B-17 formations. For the men in the bombers, the sight was surreal. The jet engines emitted a sound unlike anything they had ever heard before, a high-pitched whine that seemed almost otherworldly. There was an instinctive pause, a collective intake of breath as the crews realized what they were seeing. These weren't the lumbering, propeller-driven fighters of the past. They were something faster, deadlier, and almost unimaginable in their speed and agility. In that moment, for a few fleeting seconds, some of the men even dared to think that the war was ending not in the way they had hoped, but in the shocking escalation of technology before them. The jets streaked across the sky with alarming velocity, attacking in brief, precise bursts before vanishing almost as quickly as they appeared. The B-17 seconds, designed to endure heavy damage, now faced an enemy that was almost untouchable. Traditional defensive tactics seemed ineffective. The formation gunners squeezed their triggers, bullets tearing through the air, but the jets seemed to dance around the fire, unharmed and unstoppable. The crew's adrenaline surged, a mixture of awe and sheer terror. Amid the chaos, the men relied on training, instinct, and the trust in the men beside them. Each gunner, each pilot, each bombardier had a role, a rhythm to follow that could mean the difference between life and death. Radios crackled with urgent commands, the voices tense but controlled. The bombardier readied the bombs, knowing that if the formation broke, the mission and survival could fail. The pilots banked and adjusted, trying to maintain altitude and course while evading attacks that seemed almost science fiction in their speed. And yet, amidst the fear, there was a strange sense of wonder. These jets represented the future of aerial combat, a glimpse of what was to come long after the war ended. The crews would later recall the sight with a mix of dread and fascination, realizing that they had witnessed a pivotal moment in history. It was as though time itself had slowed for them, the roar of engines and the staccato bursts of gunfire becoming part of a surreal tapestry that would haunt their memories forever. Even as the jets came and went, the mission continued. The B-17 seconds dropped their bombs on targets, fulfilling their objective despite the extraordinary threat overhead. Ground crews far below would later survey the damage, reporting burned-out factories and shattered railways, unaware of the aerial drama that had unfolded above. For the men in the air, every second stretched into eternity. Each maneuver, each evasive action, was a dance with fate itself, a fragile balance between bravery, skill, and luck. By the time the bombers began their return flight, the crews had experienced something they would never forget. The encounter with the jets had been brief, but its impact was profound. Men who had faced death countless times now faced a new reality. The age of propeller-driven fighters was ending, and the age of jets had begun. They had glimpsed the future of warfare in a moment that seemed both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. And though the war still raged below, in that sky over Germany, for a fleeting moment, the impossible had become real. The sun climbed higher as the B-17 formation pressed onward, metal birds glinting against a cobalt sky. Inside each aircraft, tension coiled tightly in the stomachs of the men, a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and adrenaline. The jets had appeared suddenly, like phantoms, striking with precision and disappearing just as quickly. The crews had never faced anything like it. These were not the clumsy, predictable fighters of the past. They were harbingers of a new era of warfare, machines that could challenge even the most seasoned airmen. The first moments of the encounter had left the men stunned, but instinct kicked in. Gunners scanned the sky, eyes straining to track the almost invisible movements of the May 262 seconds. They learned quickly. These jets attacked in lightning bursts, diving at the bombers with an almost predatory efficiency before climbing back into the stratosphere. Anti-aircraft guns had little effect. The speed and maneuverability of the jets rendered traditional tactics almost useless. For the crews, it was a humbling realization that the war they had known propeller against propeller, flak against bomber, was already changing in ways they could hardly comprehend. Inside the cockpit, pilots struggled to maintain formation while evading these unprecedented attacks. Every adjustment of the throttle, every bank of the wings, had to be perfectly timed. One miscalculation could spell disaster. The navigator called out headings, the bombardier watched for bursts of flak, and the gunners kept their eyes glued to the sky, rifles rattling in a desperate rhythm. Communication crackled over the radios, voices tense but steady. They shared observations. 2 o'clock, diving fast, closing in from the port side. They're gone, for now. It was a dance of survival, a fleeting choreography against an almost invisible enemy. The crew's fear was palpable, but so was their awe. No one had seen jets in action before, not like this. The Me 262 seconds were cutting-edge technology, capable of speeds that made traditional fighters look sluggish. They could climb faster, dive faster, turn faster. They were a glimpse into the future, terrifyingly immediate. Some gunners, watching the jets streak past, later said they thought the war might already be over, not in the sense of victory, but in the sense that a new kind of warfare had arrived, one that would make everything they knew obsolete. Despite the danger, the B-17 seconds pressed on. Their mission was clear: destroy strategic targets that crippled Germany's war machine. Factories, railway hubs, supply depots, all vital to the German war effort, lay below, waiting for the bombs to fall. The men had trained for this, drilled in precision, and relied on their tight formations to provide mutual protection. The jets had disrupted that rhythm, but the airmen adapted, learning to weave evasive patterns without losing cohesion. Every maneuver required split-second decisions, every second measured in life or death. What made the encounter even more remarkable was how rare these jet attacks were. The Luftwaffe had only just begun deploying the Me 262 inches significant numbers. Intelligence had warned the Allies of their existence, but no one had seen them in the wild like this. For the B-17 crews, this was uncharted territory. The jets were fast, sleek, and nearly untouchable, but they had limitations. Their engines were delicate, acceleration was slower at low speeds, and they required careful handling. The airmen observed these patterns, noting small windows of opportunity in which their defensive fire could be effective. It was a deadly learning experience, a live lesson in the evolution of aerial warfare. Amid the technical details, human stories unfolded. One tail gunner, hands blistered and muscles screaming, kept firing at a jet that swooped past his turret. He would later describe it as surreal, watching the enemy appear like a silver streak, then vanish into the clouds, as if it had never been there. In the cockpit, pilots shared nervous laughter, a coping mechanism against the fear that threatened to overwhelm them. They swapped quick, whispered jokes, traded observations, and sometimes simply stared at the sky in disbelief. For all the training and preparation, nothing could have readied them for this moment. The bomber crews also began noticing something strange. The jets seemed to strike only briefly before retreating, almost as if testing them, rather than committing to a prolonged attack. Perhaps this was due to the limited range of the jet engines, or the Luftwaffe's cautious deployment of their new weapon. Whatever the reason, it gave the B-17 seconds a fighting chance. They pressed forward, dropping bombs with deadly precision. Factories smouldered below, rail lines were shredded, and the destruction would ripple through Germany's logistical network. Yet, the men's thoughts often returned to the sky above. Every streak of silver metal brought a shiver of awe and terror. For some, the encounter felt almost apocalyptic. These jets were faster than anything they had faced, unrelenting in their pursuit, and yet strangely graceful. They represented the next chapter of warfare, a frightening vision of what was to come. The B-17 seconds, built for durability and firepower, suddenly seemed like relics of a bygone era. The airmen realized that the war was evolving, and that the battlefield of tomorrow would be faster, deadlier, and far more unpredictable. Despite the fear, the crews held their nerve. They executed evasive maneuvers, maintained formation, and completed their bombing runs. Each bomber that returned to England that day carried stories of jets that had streaked across the sky, tales that would echo through Air Force barracks for years to come. The experience was as much psychological as it was physical, a sudden confrontation with the future, and a reminder that survival depended on courage, quick thinking, and the bond between men in the air. The day's events also forced a reckoning with strategy and technology. The Allied forces realized the implications of encountering jets. Bomber formations would need new tactics, gunners would require training for faster targets, and intelligence would have to track the deployment of this new threat. For the crews, it was a moment of clarity. The war was far from over, but the rules had changed. The sky itself had become a new battlefield, one in which speed, innovation, and adaptability would determine life or death. As the bombers turned for home, the adrenaline still surged. Pilots scanned the horizon for returning threats, gunners cleaned their weapons, and radio operators reported their positions. Stories of the jet encounters were whispered, exchanged with wide-eyed fascination. No one had imagined witnessing such machines in combat, and the memory of that surreal, electrifying sight would linger long after the war ended. The men had survived, but they had also glimpsed the future of aerial combat, a future that promised faster, more dangerous skies. The 11th of September, 1944, was etched into their minds not for the missions they completed on the ground, but for the extraordinary, almost unbelievable events in the sky. They had flown into history, and the experience had left an indelible mark, a mixture of fear, awe, and the strange exhilaration that comes from confronting something unprecedented. The war was still raging, the skies were still dangerous, but for one day, these airmen had seen the future unfold before their eyes. The morning air over Germany was unusually calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos that would soon erupt. The B-17 formations, glinting silver under the sun, pressed onward toward their targets. Inside the planes, men gripped their instruments, scanning the horizon with a mix of anticipation and unease. Every sortie had the potential to be their last. And yet, despite the exhaustion from previous missions, there was a quiet determination. These crews had been through so much: the flak, the enemy fighters, the endless hours over hostile territory, and they had survived. But what awaited them that day was something entirely unprecedented. As they approached their targets, small, fast-moving blurs appeared in the distance. At first, the crews assumed they were the usual German fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, or Fokker-Wulfs they had faced countless times before. But these were different. The shapes were sleeker, more streamlined, almost otherworldly. And then the unmistakable sound reached them, a high-pitched whine, slicing through the roar of B-17 engines. The men realized with a jolt what they were seeing: Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighters, the first operational jets in history, and they were attacking the formation. Panic and awe swept through the crews at once. These were not ordinary fighters. Their speed was staggering, their attacks lightning fast, almost impossible to track. The jets dove on the bombers in brief, deadly bursts, firing and climbing back into the clouds with an efficiency that left the gunners scrambling. Every defensive tactic the men had relied on for years suddenly seemed inadequate. Bullets tore through the air, tracer rounds arcing toward the jets, but the craft were too fast, too agile. Inside the cockpits, the pilots worked frantically. Maintaining formation was crucial, both for accuracy and survival. Yet evading these new threats required maneuvers they had never practiced. The navigator called out headings, the bombardier monitored the dropping bombs, and gunners scanned for fleeting glimpses of the enemy. Every second felt stretched, every movement measured, every decision a gamble with life itself. Radios crackled with urgent updates. Me, 262, port side, diving, brake left, brake left. The tension was palpable, a mix of fear and unspoken exhilaration. The tail gunners were among the first to witness the jet's terrifying power up close. One gunner later described it as watching silver streaks of death flash past, faster than anything I've ever seen. For a moment, I thought the world had changed, and the war was over in ways we couldn't even understand. The jets weren't just fast, they were precise, almost surgical in their attacks. They tested the formation with short, lightning-fast dives, leaving a trail of terror, but seldom sticking around for a prolonged engagement. The men quickly realized that these jets, while deadly, also had limits. Their engines overheated if pushed too hard, and their range was restricted. Despite the unprecedented danger, the bomber crews continued their mission. Factories, rail hubs, and supply depots lay below, essential targets for crippling Germany's ability to fight. The men had trained for this moment, yet nothing could have fully prepared them for the surreal reality of jet fighters streaking across the sky. Each bomb dropped was a calculated act of defiance, a reminder that even in the face of this new threat, the Allies would not falter. Smoke rose from destroyed targets, evidence of their relentless precision, even as the sky above remained a battlefield. There was also a strange, almost hypnotic awe in the air. For all the fear, the crews were witnessing history unfold in real time. Jets that had existed only in blueprints and secret intelligence were now slicing across the sky with deadly grace. For a brief moment, it was difficult to comprehend what they were seeing: machines that seemed to defy everything the men had known about aerial combat. Some gunners admitted later that, for a split second, they had entertained the impossible thought. Could this be the end of the war? Not because they had won, but because the enemy had arrived with something beyond imagination. As the mission progressed, the crews adapted. Evasive patterns were adjusted, formations tightened, and gunners learned to anticipate the jets' attacks. Every successful maneuver brought a surge of relief, every near miss a reminder of mortality. The pilots coordinated with each other, banking and climbing in response to attacks, while the gunners maintained a constant vigil. There was no room for hesitation. Hesitation meant death. And yet, amidst the terror, there was camaraderie, a quiet understanding that survival depended on trust in the men beside you. The return flight offered no respite. The jets, though not always in pursuit, remained a psychological presence. Each silhouette on the horizon, each whine of an engine, was a trigger for heightened alertness. The men reflected on what they had witnessed. This was not just a new plane, but a symbol of a new kind of war. The aerial battlefield was changing, becoming faster, more unpredictable, and more lethal. The B-17 crews had survived, but they had also glimpsed a future in which the rules of combat would be rewritten. Stories from that day would ripple through the ranks for years. Tail gunners recounted streaks of silver flashing past their sights. Pilots described maneuvers executed on instinct alone, and bombardiers spoke of the strange combination of fear and wonder that colored their memories. The encounter with the Me 262 seconds was brief, but its impact was enduring. For the men in the air, the 11th of September, 1944, became a moment that defined not just a mission, but an era, a turning point, that heralded the arrival of a new, almost unimaginable kind of warfare. Even as the B-17 seconds crossed back over the English Channel, the adrenaline lingered. Each man carried the memory of silver jets streaking through the sky, a reminder of both human innovation and the terrifying potential of war. They had survived, yes, but the encounter left an indelible mark, a mixture of awe, relief, and the sobering realization that the war was far from over. What they had witnessed was not the end, but a glimpse into the future, a fast-moving, deadly future, where the sky itself had become a new kind of battlefield. By the time they touched down on English soil, hearts still racing, the men of the 8th Air Force understood something fundamental. Survival in this war was no longer just about courage or skill, it was about adaptation. The jets had changed everything. The lessons learned that day would influence tactics, training, and strategy for the remainder of the conflict. The 11th of September, 1944, was not just another day of bombing missions. It was a day when the impossible became real, when ordinary airmen confronted extraordinary machines, and when the war in the skies would never be the same again.